We are now going to go and set up input. To start our discussion with input, I'm going to create a new folder that I'm going to call input. Now, inside of this input folder, we are going to talk about two different things. If I right click inside of this content browser and go to the input section, you can see there's a few different options for us. The ones that we are going to be concerned about today are the input action and the input mapping context. Let's start with the input action. I'm going to call this IA for input action _ move, and I'm going to open that up. This is going to represent our movement as an input action or as a player made action in game. Not much setup actually needs to be done inside of the actual input action. Way more gets set up inside of the input mapping context. But what we do need to set up here is the value type. Let me show you what this looks like. So currently our IA move is set to have a value type of Boolean. That means true or false. If we look what this looks like inside of blueprints, we can see this action value is of type Boolean. If I go ahead and switch this to be an axis 1D inside of our player paddle, we can see this is now a float, which means it's a number. And similarly, I can also do this for a 2-dimensional vector, which changes this to be a 2-dimensional vector, and so on. So let's ask ourselves, what do we need? If this was a third-person game or a first-person game, we'd probably want the 2D vector because we'd be moving in 2 dimensions. In our game, we're only going to be moving in 1 direction. So we're going to set this to be an axis 1D. Most often, if you're using an input like a button press, you're going to use the Boolean option. You care whether it is actively being held down or not. But for us, we care about which direction is being held down. And we're going to configure that in the mapping context in just a second. So let's go back to our content drawer here inside of our input folder, and then let's right click into the input section and load up an input mapping context. I'm going to call this my IMC _ player actions. And let's open that up. This is where we actually do all the meat and potatoes of our inputting. Underneath this mapping section here, we can hit the plus section to add a mapping to our context. First, we have to give it an input action. For us, there is going to be some duplication because the third person template comes with input action. So what I'm going to do just to make our lives easier here is I'm going to go back to our content drawer. I'm just going to rename our IA move to be IA movement. That should be an easy enough change so that we can make sure we're choosing the right one. In an actual project, you wouldn't have this duplication issue. But regardless, now we can set our IA movement to be our input action. And now we get to set up what triggers this action. You can set this up for gamepads, controllers, keyboard, mouse, whatever you want. But for today, we're just going to do our keyboard. Just to show you that things work, I'm going to start by hitting this button here and then clicking the button I want to trigger this. And I'm going to tap W because that'll be our up button, let's say. You are more than welcome to add multiple different movements here. You can set this to be the up arrow. And now on both the up arrow and W being pressed, we are going to receive input. What input are we receiving? We are using a 1-dimensional float, which means we're going to receive a value of 1 whenever we are holding this button down. So let's take a second to actually set up this input mapping context in our paddle. If we go into our player paddle, we're going to scroll up and look at this begin play method here. Right click to get the controller. From there, we need to make sure this is actually our player's control. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something called a cast to player controller. Connect that there. Casting basically makes sure that what we are passing in is the object that we are specifying. So we are getting the controller that controls our player paddle. And if it is a player controller, then we are going to take this branch here. If it is not a player controller, then we would take this branch here. And then with this confirmation that this is a player controller, we're able to use player controller methods by using this third option here. So we're going to get something that's stored on our player controller called the enhanced input local player subsystem. And we're going to be paranoid and we're going to make sure that this is valid. And the way we do that is we type is valid and we take the question mark one and we're going to say, is this input system valid? If it is valid, we're going to add a mapping context. What mapping context are we going to add? Well, we get to choose from a drop down and it's going to be our player actions that we're setting up here. Don't worry about priority for the purposes of this project. Sometimes there's multiple input mapping contexts. So then from there, this little blurb of code here is what actually sets up this paddle to be able to receive input. Then from there, this input action is now able to be called because we have our mapping context. So if I drag off of this and do print string, then I can connect our action value so that we print the value that is being returned when we press a button. And I'm going to use this to show you a couple of things. When I hit play here, you can see we're still controlling that third person pawn. So first we have to make sure we're controlling a paddle. The way we're going to do that is we're going to go to edit, project settings. Then we could go to maps and modes. And we can see here that the default game mode is being used is this BP _ third person game mode. We need to find this in order to change it. If we do want to find it nice and easy, we can hit this little button here that allows us to instantly browse to that asset in the content browser. We can now close our project settings and we're going to open up our third person game mode. Inside of the third person game mode, there is a whole bunch of default classes that are shown here. Our default Pong class is currently set up to be the BP underscore third person character. We need to change that to be our BP underscore player paddle. Now, instead of spawning in that human, we're going to spawn in our beautiful gray block. And now when I go back inside of our player paddle for simplicity and hit play, you can see that we spawn our beautiful cube. And now when I hit W, you can see that we're printing that 1.0 in the top left corner. Same happens when I hit the up key. Let's talk about the differences between all of these different types of input movements. So to show this off, I've created a one-word print string that'll happen depending on the input type that is being used here. A lot of these are self-explanatory, but let's go over them. Triggered happens so long as the triggered condition is taking place. We can set triggered conditions inside of the mapping context here by looking at our triggers. If I put an element into this, we can see that we can do a lot of different things as what officially triggers the input action. But once that trigger has been met, that's when the triggered appears. For instance, if I do this hold, we can see that the trigger fires once the input has remained actuated for the hold time threshold. But let's come back to that in a second. Right now, if I hit play, when I press W, you can see that we have start, then a few frames of trigger, and then complete it. That's because when I press the button, start happens first, then after start, so long as the button is still being held, every frame we are going to receive an input. And then once I let go of the button, the completed event fires. But you will notice that the canceled and ongoing did not. Well, let's adjust our input action just for fun. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna add this hold trigger here, and feel free, you can just look at this and you don't have to follow along. We can now add a hold time threshold of say 3 seconds. We can also say, should this trigger fire only once or fire every frame once the hold time is met? I'm gonna say that this is only gonna be one shot to avoid things cluttering up the screen. So now I'm going to hit save and I'm going to hit play. So what you're going to see here is first started appears, then we have ongoing, and then we have canceled. Ongoing is what's called while we're waiting for the trigger to take place. So I'm going to hold this down and I'm going to count to 3. And then you can see that we have the trigger take place and then complete it. So in the event that we have a more convoluted trigger, then the ongoing event is going to be called until the trigger condition is met. If we don't meet the trigger condition and stop holding the button down, then you will see that the canceled. And let's show that one more time. So if I just press the W key, you can see we start, we have ongoings, and then we cancel. But when I hold that button for infinitely longer than I was intending to, then we have our trigger and then the completed actions follow. There's obviously more that we could get into with what all of these different triggers do, but I'll leave it up to you to read through and go into more detail on that on your own. But I hope that makes sense. The next thing we have to talk about is modifiers. We don't always want to move in the upwards direction. We would hopefully like to move down too. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another binding, and I'm going to set that to be the S key. And just for being consistent, I'll also add one for the down arrow as well. But what's going to happen here is we need to add a modifier. A modifier takes the input that is happening because we are triggering an event, and then it modifies it in some way. I know, really hard stuff there. The types of modifiers that we can do definitely can be a little more complicated. The main ones that I use are swizzling and negating. Negating inverts the axis. Right now, when we're holding down this S key, we'd be returning a value of +1. But if we negate that, then we're going to return -1, which is perfect because we want to use the S and down key to move down. So we want to have the opposite effect of our W and up key. And only because I mentioned it, swizzling is what allows you to map successfully into a 2D space. If you're interested in looking at a swizzle that is working, look at the third person input mapping context that's provided by the template, and you'll be able to see what it looks like in action. But for the purposes of our project, we're going to negate the input that comes in when we press either the S key or down. So now when I save that, I'm going to go back into my player paddle, and let's reconfigure things so that we are once again printing the action value that is returned when we're holding the button down. Let's compile, save, and I'm going to hit play. So when I hit W, we're having that +1 return, and when I hit S, we have that -1 return. And this is what's going to allow us to actually move. But overall, that is the summary and basic overview of how input actions work. This is obviously just the tip of the iceberg, but I hope this sets you on the right path as you're going and making your own projects.